The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the weathered ranch house, dust settling like a veil over the dry Montana plains. Eleanor Hartwell stepped down carefully, her worn travel dress clinging to her thin frame after 3 weeks of jarring roads and cramped train cars. She was 24 years old, plain-faced, and carrying everything she owned in a single carpetbag. She had answered the advertisement out of desperation. Boston had offered her nothing but factory work in a cramped boarding house room she shared with 3 other women. The letter from Mr. James Thornton had been straightforward: widower, cattle rancher, 1 son, seeking a respectable woman for marriage and help with the homestead. James Thornton emerged from the barn, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and gray threading through his dark hair. He was perhaps 40, with kind eyes that held a deep sadness. He removed his hat as he approached. "Miss Hartwell," he said simply, his voice rough from disuse. "Mr. Thornton." She curtsied slightly, an old habit. Behind his father's leg, a small boy peered out, no more than 7 years old, with his father's dark hair and eyes the color of creek water. The child's face was solemn, too serious for one so young. "This is Thomas," James said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. The boy said nothing, just stared at Eleanor with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. She offered him a gentle smile, but he didn't return it. That evening, over a simple supper of beans and cornbread that James had clearly struggled to prepare, Eleanor felt the weight of her decision settling over her like a heavy blanket. The house was sparse and desperately needed a woman's touch. The boy ate in silence, stealing glances at her when he thought she wasn't looking. "The Reverend can come out next Sunday," James said quietly. "If that suits you." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she set down her fork. This was happening so fast. She looked around the rough cabin, at this stranger across from her, at the silent child who had lost his mother. "Mr. Thornton," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "you can send me back. If I'm not what you expected." James looked at her steadily. Before he could respond, Thomas suddenly spoke for the first time. "No," the boy said firmly, his small voice cutting through the room. "You stay." Eleanor stared at the child, surprised by the conviction in his voice. James looked equally taken aback. Apparently Thomas had spoken more words to this stranger in one sentence than he'd spoken to his father in weeks. "Thomas," James began gently, but the boy was already pushing back from the table. "She smells like Mama," Thomas said, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "Not the same, but, like bread. And soap. Real soap." Eleanor's heart clenched. She understood then, this child had been living in a house without softness, without the small comforts a woman's presence provided. She could see it now in the unwashed curtains, the floor that needed scrubbing, the little boy's hair that needed proper cutting. "Thomas has been." James struggled for words. "Since Mary passed 2 years ago, he hasn't taken to anyone. Not the neighbor women who've tried to help, not even his own aunt who came from Denver." The boy moved closer to Eleanor, studying her face with that same unsettling intensity. Then, without warning, he climbed into her lap as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Eleanor froze, unsure, then slowly wrapped her arms around the small, sturdy body. Thomas buried his face against her shoulder. "Don't go," he whispered. Over the child's head, Eleanor met James's eyes. She saw hope there, and something like relief, but also a question. He was giving her the choice, even now. "I have nowhere to go back to," Eleanor admitted quietly. "No family, no prospects. I came here for practical reasons, Mr. Thornton. I won't pretend it was for love or adventure." "I know," James said. "My reasons were practical too. I need help with the ranch, and Thomas needs a mother. I can't give you romance from the penny dreadfuls, Miss Hartwell. But I can promise you respect, a roof over your head, and a share in everything I build." Eleanor looked down at the boy in her arms, who had relaxed against her as if he'd been waiting his whole life to do so. She thought of the factory looms, the gray Boston winters, the endless loneliness of her former life. "Then I'll stay," she said. "And please, call me Eleanor." For the first time, James smiled, a small, tentative thing, but genuine. "Eleanor," he repeated. "And I'm James." That night, Eleanor lay in the small bedroom James had prepared for her, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, the wind whispering through the eaves, the creak of James's footsteps in the main room as he banked the fire for the night. She had made her choice. Now she would have to live it. The Reverend came the following Sunday as promised, a jovial man who asked few questions and offered many blessings. Eleanor wore the only good dress she owned, and James had cleaned up remarkably well, his hair slicked back and his Sunday shirt pressed with obvious effort. Thomas stood between them during the ceremony, holding both their hands, as if binding them together himself. The weeks that followed were not easy. Eleanor had never run a household of this size, had never cooked for ranch hands during harvest season, had never tended a vegetable garden in soil that seemed determined to grow only rocks and stubborn weeds. Her hands, soft from factory work, blistered and calloused. But slowly, the house transformed. Curtains were washed and mended. The floor gleamed. The scent of fresh bread filled the rooms each morning. Eleanor discovered she had a talent for making simple ingredients stretch, for creating meals that brought satisfied sighs from the men who worked the ranch. James was kind, patient, and surprisingly gentle. He never demanded more than she was willing to give. Their relationship grew like the careful cultivation of her garden, with attention, patience, and time. He taught her to ride, to read the weather, to understand the rhythm of ranch life. She taught him that a house could be more than just shelter, that supper could be more than sustenance, that conversation could fill the evening hours. But it was Thomas who truly opened Eleanor's heart. The boy followed her everywhere, helping with chores, chattering about his day, bringing her wildflowers from the meadow and smooth stones from the creek. At night, she would tuck him into bed and tell him stories, some from books she'd read, others spun from her own imagination. One evening, as autumn painted the mountains gold and crimson, Eleanor sat on the porch with her mending. James joined her, settling into the chair beside hers with a satisfied grunt after a long day. "You've made this place a home again," he said quietly. "I didn't realize how much we'd just been surviving until you showed us what living could be." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. "I didn't realize how empty my life was until I came here. I thought I was doing this out of necessity, but somewhere along the way it became more," James finished. "Yes," she whispered. Inside, they could hear Thomas singing to himself as he played with the wooden horses James had carved for him. The sound was pure joy, so different from the silent, solemn child who had met her at the stagecoach. James reached over and took Eleanor's hand, calloused palm against calloused palm, two people who had learned to build something real from a practical arrangement. "My boy chose right," James said, a smile in his voice. Eleanor squeezed his hand, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "We all chose right," she said. And in that moment, sitting on the porch of her Montana ranch house with her husband beside her and her son's laughter floating through the window, Eleanor Hartwell Thornton knew she was finally home.